Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapters 22, verses 39 through 53, just the end of that chapter and also the end of the book. And indeed, I'm going to call this section the end of the beginning. Verse 39 and 40 are going to talk about Ahab, just looking back briefly at his life. We'll call it Ahab's legacy, and it will underscore his building projects. Then we'll see in verses 41 through 50, Jehoshaphat and his legacy. It will be a legacy of faithfulness, of success, and the occasional failure. And then we'll see Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, and his legacy, and it will be mentioned very briefly, just a couple of 3 verses of his unfaithfulness and the evil of his reign. Verse 39, now the rest of the acts of Ahab, and we looked last time at Ahab's death in battle, how he had been shot by an arrow, and all that he did, and the ivory house which he built. Now remember, when you read about an ivory house, that constitutes great wealth. That doesn't mean the entire house was built of ivory. That would be virtually impossible. But it does mean that he had ivory panels set in and around his house. And that was a sign of his great wealth, because ivory comes from elephant tusks, and that has to be transported long distance, either from Africa or from India, from very far away in any case. And so notice the ivory house which he built and all the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? So if you want to read more about Ahab, you're going to have to go to the book of Chronicles, and you will see both expansions on the stories we have seen and other stories as well. Verse 40, so Ahab slept with his fathers, and Ahaziah his son became king in his place. And so we'd had Ahab, remember he was married to Jezebel, and we're going to see eventually 3 children from that marriage. We're seeing here Ahaziah. When he dies, we're going to see his brother. It won't go to his son, it will go to his brother, Joram. And then Athaliah will be their sister. And we're going to see all 3 of them involved in the politics of Israel and of Judah. Speaking of Judah, verse 41, now we move down south to Judah. Now Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, became king over Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. First Kings so far, and we're going to see the same thing in 2 Kings. It goes back and forth from Israel in the north to Judah in the south, back to Israel in the north. And so we're just getting, trying to go in somewhat chronological order. Verse 42, Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. It was a good time to reign. And his mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shilhi. Verse 43, he walked in all the way of Asa, his father. That's a good thing, because of the kings that we've seen in the southern kingdom. Some of them have been good, some of them have been sort of mediocre, some of them have been not so good. Here we see a good king, because Asa had been a good king, and Jehoshaphat likewise, doing right in the sight of the Lord. However, and notice there's a stipulation, he was good, but here's the negative. The high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. And verse 44, Jehoshaphat also made peace with the king of Israel. Now, is that good? Is that bad? Well, perhaps it was a mixed bag. Verse 45, now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat and his might which he showed, how he warred, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And likewise, when we get to Chronicles, we're going to see some additional stories of Jehoshaphat and some of the things that he did, some really, really good stories. Verse 46, the remnant of the Sodomites who remained in the days of his father Asa, he expelled from the land. Now that term Sodomites, the HaKodesh. And that's an interesting term, because it's not translated literally. Literally, HaKodesh means the holy ones. The NIV rendered this the male shrine pot prostitutes. The New Jerusalem Bible calls this the male sacred prostitutes. Notice that it's in the masculine, so that's why both those translations render it something male. And because HaKodesh literally refers to the holy ones, but they're not holy in the sense of being good holy. They're holy in the sense that they're set apart for a particular purpose, and it's not a good purpose. And so I think the New American Standard has tried to to communicate that by the term sodomites. That's not very literal. I think that is interpretive, but it's probably a correct interpretation. In other words, they were doing some things like you had done back in the city of Sodom with Sodom and Gomorrah and Lot, and remember how the men had wanted to rape some what they thought were other men. They were actually angels, and it's that sort of action that had now been taking place in the country of Judah, and Jehoshaphat finishes the expulsion of that terrible worship that was taking place in the land. Verse 47, now there was no king in Edom. And Chronicles actually tells us the story of why there was no king in Edom, how that came to be. A deputy was king. Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold. Now, they're ships not that he's sending to Tarshish to buy them. Tarshish was way across on the other side of the known world, over in the area that we call Spain today, very far from the Israelites. So ships of Tarshish are probably like Tarshish-style ships. In other words, ships that were supposed to be so seaworthy they could get you to Tarshish. And so he makes these ships not to go to Tarshish, but to go to Ophir. This is to the south, either in southern Arabia or perhaps Africa or perhaps even further. But he's sending for gold. But notice, but they did not go, for the ships were broken at Ezion Geber. Now, Ezion Geber is there. Notice in the map, we think it's probably there, the upper reaches of what we call today the Gulf of Aqaba. They called that part of the Red Sea, although back then they called it the Reed Sea, the Sea of Reeds. But it's the same body of water, different name. But these ships that he made, they did not get very far. And that underscores something that we've known all along about the Jewish people. The Jewish people built a good kingdom there, beginning with David and then Solomon, and even the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. But they were always a nation of people who stayed largely on land. We do not see the Jewish people going too much to sea. Here is an attempt that they do. He's trying to follow in the footsteps of Solomon, who actually did have ships that set sail and went all the way down to either southern Arabia or Africa, and brought back all sorts of things. And Jehoshaphat is trying to do that same sort of thing. But his Jewish sailors, are not up to the task, and so the ships don't get very far. Instead, they're broken at Ezion Geber. They don't get very far. And he's going to say, perhaps we ought to quit while we're ahead. You've heard the old saying, try again. And that's fine to a point, but sometimes you have to determine that was just a bad course of action. Let's not do that anymore. Verse 49, then Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat was not willing. Now, was this, before the sailing mishap? Was this afterward? Not entirely sure. But Jehoshaphat said, okay, we've had an alliance, but it's time to call it quits. And it sounds like he's doing the same thing with the ships that he's also doing with his alliance with Israel. Verse 50, and Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of his father David. And Jehoram, his son, became king in his place. So we have the passing of the mantle to the next king. But now we move back to the north, and here we go back to Israel. Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned 2 years. 2 years is not a long time to reign. We'll see why that takes place really in the next chapter. You say, I thought this was the end of the book. Well, it's the end of the book, but it's not the end of the story. And so he reigned 2 years over Israel. He did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in the way of his mother and in the way of Jeroboam, the son, not Jeroboam, the original Jeroboam. Well, actually, yes, that Jeroboam. He walked in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. Remember, Jeroboam had said, let's put golden calves at these two different places to stop people from going to worship the Lord down at the temple. And Ahaziah does the same thing, but also walking in the way of his mother. His mother had been a worshiper not of the Lord, but of Baal. Verse 53, so he does the same thing. He served Baal and worshipped him and provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger according to all that his father had done. And the book ends right there. And you say, that's a terrible place to end a book. Why does it end right there? And the answer is that this isn't the end of the book. It's only the end of this section. You see, First and Second Kings are a unit. They're really one book that have been artificially divided. We saw the story begin with the kingdom of Solomon, and we saw wars of Judah and Israel, and then the ministry of Elijah. And even though Elijah hasn't been mentioned lately, we're still in that section. And we're going to come in 2 Kings chapter 2 to where that prophetic mantle is passed from Elijah to Elisha. And then we'll see not the ministry of Elijah, but then we'll see the ministry of Elisha from chapter 3 to 13 of 2 Kings. We'll see more wars of Israel and Judah, and Israel indeed will come to an end in chapter 17. Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, will be taken away into captivity. And finally, we'll see just the kingdom of Judah at the end of the book. And so the story continues, and what we have is not the end, but only the end of the beginning of the story, because the story must go on.